Hello, this is Professor Kuehn and welcome back to my lectures on astronomy, where we've been looking at the work of Nicholas Copernicus, his book on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres. From here on out, I'll probably just call them the revolutions rather than keep saying on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres because it's just too long to say. In any case, we're looking at page 135 in a student's guide to the great physics texts. And we've gotten to book 1, his introduction. And I want to begin by mentioning that what Copernicus does here is he's trying to place a study of astronomy and specifically his work in a broader context. You might think back to when we studied Ptolemy and his Almagest. The first thing he did was try to place astronomy into a broader context. Remember, he divided the study of theoretical philosophy into theology, physics, and mathematics, and astronomy fit into the branch of mathematics. Copernicus is doing a similar kind of thing here. He's going to argue that astronomy is one of the liberal arts. So let's take a look at this first paragraph on the bottom of page 135, and I want to start with this question: what should we study? You have many choices as a student as to what you're going to study, and what he's doing right here is he's asking this question quite directly: what should we study? And he says that that which we should study is that which deals with things that are beautiful and worthy of knowledge, as opposed to, of course, things that are not worth your time to study, right? So the question is, what is worth your time? And he says the things that are beautiful. Now, what specifically is he saying we should study? And he goes on to say that the thing that we should be focusing our studies on is the cosmos, that carefully ordered whole of this world, which was carved out, so to speak, in ancient times by God himself. God carved it out with such skill and beauty that it is sometimes mistaken by those who do not know God as a visible God itself on account of its elegance. And this study of the cosmos, of the orderly arrangement of the whole that was carved out by God in ancient times, this is called astronomy. That's what Copernicus calls it. He says it is the head of the liberal arts. So that raises the question immediately: what are the liberal arts? So let's ask that question. What are the liberal arts? You are studying here, probably at Wisconsin Lutheran College. Maybe you're just listening to this lecture, but you've probably heard the term liberal arts used quite often. Let me just state, first of all, historically how the liberal arts were seen. I know this is a bit of a digression, but this will provide some background for what Copernicus is getting at here. So, first of all, what are the liberal arts? Historically, they were divided into 7. So, there was grammar. The second was logic. And the third was rhetoric. What do we mean by grammar, logic, and rhetoric? Well, grammar you might think of at the most basic level as how to use language properly. But more generally, we might think of it as the art of inventing and combining symbols. Some of you might recognize some of my definitions here as being taken from Sister Joseph Miriam. Logic is the art of thinking, how to think well, how not to contradict yourself, for example. Rhetoric is the art of communication. Those 3 liberal arts are sometimes said to make up the trivium. That comes from a Latin word, tri meaning 3 and via meaning way, so the 3 ways, okay? And then the next 4, 5, 6, and 7 that make up the liberal arts from a historical perspective are, first of all, arithmetic, which we would call the theory of numbers. So what are numbers and how do they work? How are they combined, for example? Music, you might think about this as an application of the theory of numbers. those of you who study music might not think about music that way as an application of the theory of numbers, but if you learn some music theory, you learn that music is organized according to ratios of tones, and that is very closely related to ratios and the theory of arithmetic. The next one is geometry, which you might think about as the theory of space. How do we understand the distance between objects? And then finally, astronomy, and that is what Copernicus is interested in. Astronomy, you might think of this as the application of the theory of space. These two, by the way, deal with discrete quantities. Discrete quantities, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whereas these deal with continuous quantities. Things that you could divide, but you just can keep dividing them again and again and again without stopping. So geometry, think about space. Space deals with a continuous region between two objects. If I hold up my two fingers, there is space between them, and that space isn't a specific number, rather it's a continuous region that can be divided potentially infinitely. By the way, these four are sometimes called the quadrivium. You might see there the number 4, quad, quator, and vium is way, so the 4 ways. So these are the historical liberal arts. Maybe I'll mention here historically. And I know there might be some controversy about which ones of these should be historically considered as liberal arts, but there's some consensus that those are the 7 liberal arts. Now, why are these called liberal arts? Well, it might help to think about these as opposed to utilitarian arts. So the liberal arts, you'll see where I'm going with this in a moment. The liberal arts are contrasted with, first of all, the utilitarian arts, and secondly, the fine arts. What do we mean by the utilitarian arts? Well, there are many of them. They basically have to do with things like carpentry, banking, plumbing, law, medicine. You might even put the care for souls in there, like pastoral work. It's a utilitarian or practical art. And the fine arts would then be things like painting, instrumental music. I know some of you are studying that. Dance or drama. Okay. So the liberal arts are contrasted with utilitarian arts and fine arts. What is the main difference between these? Well, the liberal arts are activities, one might say, that are directed not at serving one's neighbor, but rather at developing yourself into what you, as a creature of God, should be. So if you look at these other ones, carpentry, banking, plumbing, law, medicine, the purpose of those is essentially to help someone else. So you're building a shelf so that you can sell this shelf and provide something for another person. Banking, you're working with someone's money, you're providing a financial service for someone else. Even the fine arts, instrumental music, to a large extent, it's aimed at producing music to please someone else. The liberal arts, on the other hand, are not designed to serve one's neighbor, but rather to develop you into the kind of person that you should be as a creature of God. You might think about it this way. Well, so let me just write that down. So the liberal arts are not primarily directed at serving others, as the others are, as the utilitarian and fine arts are, but rather at becoming what you might say as the crown of God's creation, as a creature of God, should be. Okay, so you might think about it also this way, and maybe this will give you another way of thinking about it. Every sentence, so this is a little aside to help you understand the distinction between the liberal arts and the other kinds of arts. So every sentence has a subject and a predicate. A subject and a predicate. Okay, so the subject is really what you're talking about, and the predicate is what you are saying about the subject. So as an example, example 1, you might say, the man carves the wood. Okay, so the man, that would be the subject. That's what you're talking about. And carves the wood would be the predicate. It's what you're saying about the man. And as maybe another example, example 2, you might say that the lily blossoms or blooms. Okay, so the lily would be the subject and blooms would be the predicate. Okay, now notice that there's an important difference that I'd like to point out between these two sentences, and then I'm going to relate that to what I've been saying about the liberal arts, the utilitarian arts, and fine arts. Notice that the verb carves is what's called a transitive verb. It's a transitive verb. Carves is transitive in the sense that it requires an object that the agent is acting on. So carves, the agent is the man, he's acting on the wood, he's carving the wood. So the verb carves is called a transitive verb. It's kind of transferring action from an agent to an object. There's a direct object in the sentence. You might think about that. Blooms, on the other hand, is an intransitive verb. Right? It's not like the lily is blooming something else. The lily is blooming, it's saying something about what's happening to it. The verb bloom begins and ends in the agent, the lily. So the lily, the blooming comes from the lily and it ends in the lily. And the liberal arts are like this, in the sense that they begin and end in the agent, insofar as they're liberal arts. They're not really about, the liberal arts are not about how you can be useful or how you can serve your neighbor in the way that the utilitarian arts are. So in the utilitarian arts, you're doing something so that you can help someone else. There's an object outside of yourself that you're working on or helping with the utilitarian arts, which is very important. But the liberal arts are more about how you should live as an intellectual, rational, and free person. Ultimately, the liberal arts are about what our nature should be as the crown of God's creation. And so that's the way that Copernicus is thinking about the liberal arts, and that is the way that historically people, the medievals, were thinking about the liberal arts. Okay, so now let's look back at Copernicus. And if you look at the bottom of page 135, he's talking about astronomy as being one of the liberal arts. Okay, he says the art which is, as it were, the head of all the liberal arts, and the one most worthy of a free man, leans upon nearly all the other branches of mathematics. And he goes on to say, since a property of all good arts is to draw the mind of man away from the vices and direct it to better things, these arts can do that more plentifully over and above the unbelievable pleasure of mind which they furnish. For who, he says, after applying himself to things which he sees established in the best order, I'll go on to the next page, and directed by divine ruling, would not, through diligent contemplation of them, and through a certain habituation be awakened to that which is best, and would not wonder at the artificer of all things, in whom all happiness, in whom is all happiness and every good. So he's saying that the liberal arts, and astronomy in particular, they're able to direct the mind to God, toward the maker of all things. In addition to the great pleasure that one derives from it in learning about the orderliness of nature, in so contemplating astronomy, one's mind is indubitably directed toward the artificer, the God, the artist who made all of these things.